Imagine possessing like a high-speed, four-dimensional visual processing system sitting right inside your skull.
Mm-hmm.
You don't just observe the world, right?
Yeah.
You see it in these complete um, rotating spatial structures.
Yeah, like you're instantly perceiving how every single variable connects.
Exactly. How time impacts physical space, how entire sprawling architectures, breathe and move all at once.
It's just an incredibly rich, high-fidelity
But
existence.
there is this massive, unavoidable biological catch. The society you inhabit, the educational systems that grade you, the corporate ladders.
They all operate almost exclusively in flat, one-dimensional dotted lines.
Right. They communicate in this sequential linear syntax. So how do you even begin to translate your reality?
It really can't. Not easily.
Yeah, like how do you compress a deeply interconnected 4D universe into a 1D language without, fundamentally losing your mind?
It's an exhausting translation process.
And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the sheer thermodynamic effort of maintaining that translation, or just the trauma of constantly being misunderstood, triggers this physiological cascade?
A cascade that actually blocks your brain's biological hardware from accessing its own memories.
Which is just wild to think about.
And it really is a question of physiological survival. What we are mapping out today for you is not, it's not a discussion about different learning styles
Right.
or like behavioral quirks. We are examining the neurobiology of self-preservation.
Yes, exactly.
Because when a deeply complex cognitive architecture is forced to operate within a hostile, low-bandwidth environment, it doesn't just adapt, it undergoes this compiled, multi-stage evolution.
Okay, let's unpack this. That evolution is our mission for today's deep dive. We're exploring a fascinating, highly technical, and honestly deeply personal set of sources.
It's incredible material.
It really is. It totally flipped my understanding of neurodivergence,
Yeah.
shifting it from a conversation about deficits to one about advanced cognitive defense systems.
Which is a much more accurate framework.
Right. And we are anchoring this exploration around two massive interlocking concepts. First, the neurobiological mechanism known as reafference theory.
Specifically drilling down into the efference copy and sensory anticipation.
Yeah, we're going to look at how a highly specific brain uses this biological loop, not just to move through the world, but to define its entire concept of happiness.
Which is profound.
And second, we're exploring a brilliant, albeit desperate, cognitive survival mechanism that our sources refer to as the engineering village.
Right. It's a structural look at exactly what a mind does to reconstruct its identity when its internal database completely crashes under the weight of trauma.
It's going to be a heavy but amazing journey.
Yeah.
So before we can understand how this brain defends itself, we have to understand what it's trying to protect, right?
Exactly. To understand the sheer scale of the defense mechanisms, you first have to understand the baseline state.
What does joy or fulfillment actually look like on a neurobiological level before it's forced into that flat 1D translation?
Well, our sources start with this profound neurocomputational theory of happiness. And surprisingly, it doesn't come from a medical journal.
No, it doesn't.
It finds its best articulation in a quote from the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges.
Which is such a fascinating connection because it takes this purely poetic sentiment and maps it perfectly onto cognitive architecture.
It really does.
So Borges wrote, music, states of happiness, mythology, faces worked by time, certain twilights in certain places want to tell us something, or said something we should not have lost or are about to say something.
This imminence of a revelation, which is not produced, is perhaps the aesthetic event.
Yes, this imminence of a revelation.
That specific phrasing, that imminence, it perfectly describes the neurobiological state this 4D mind seeks out.
The state of imminence.
Exactly. And to grasp why this matters for you as a listener, we have to look closely at reafference theory and the sources.
Right, let's get into the biology of it.
Okay, so specifically the role of the efference copy. In standard linear neurobiology, the brain is fundamentally a prediction engine. Its main goal is to minimize surprise.
Keep things predictable.
Right. So when you decide to take an action, say, reaching out to pick up a cold glass of water, your motor cortex fires a command down your spinal cord to your arm muscles.
Moving the arm.
But at the exact same millisecond, it sends a duplicate of that neural command, like a carbon copy, to your sensory cortex.
And that duplicate is the efference copy.
Yes, that's the efference copy.
So the efference copy is essentially an internal memo.
That's a great way to put it.
The motor cortex is telling the sensory cortex, like, hey, I'm moving the arm. Expect to feel a smooth, cold, cylindrical object in exactly half a second. Do not be surprised.
That is the perfect way to look at it. The efference copy sets up a sensory prediction.
Okay.
Then, when your hand actually grasps the glass, the physical sensation that travels back up your arm to your brain, that's called the reafference.
So efference is the prediction, reafference is the reality.
Exactly. And if the reafference perfectly matches the predictions set by the efference copy, the brain just cancels out the signal. The transaction is complete.
It just deletes it.
Basically, yeah. The brain says, prediction matched reality, zero new information here, collapse the experience, and move on.
Which, I mean, that makes total sense for efficiency.
Of course it does.
Because if we consciously processed every single millimeter of a familiar action, we would just be paralyzed by sensory overload, right?
You'd never get anything done. The linear brain wants to resolve the prediction quickly, get the little dopamine hit for checking the box, and move on.
It wants a flat, completed transaction. But for this 4D visual processing system, high voltage happiness is the exact opposite of a completed transaction, isn't it?
It is. True aesthetic joy for this brain is found in refusing to let that cancellation happen.
Wow.
For this specific cognitive architecture, happiness is the Borgian immanence. It is a sensory signal hovering in a perpetual state of anticipation.
Hovering in the gap.
Exactly. It dwells in the gap between the efference copy's prediction and the final physical reafference. This brain absolutely does not want the wave function to collapse into a boring, known, flat state.
So how does it stop it?
Well, the system actually employs active mechanisms to keep it suspended. The sources mention mathematical shortcuts and what neurologists call Vection illusions.
Vection illusions, right.
Yeah, that's where the brain simulates the sensation of physical movement even when the body is entirely stationary, all just to sustain this suspended state of immanence.
Is this like the moment right before the bass drops in a massive dubstep track?
Oh, that's a brilliant analogy.
Because the tension is building, the sonic architecture is expanding, and you are just suspended in that highly charged gap, or like the second before a roller coaster goes over the edge.
Yes.
Are we talking about that gap between the brain's prediction and the actual sensory realization?
What's fascinating here is that you've perfectly described the physical sensation of it. The kinetic energy is maximized, but the action hasn't resolved yet. And it is an active, metabolically expensive choice to stay in that tension. The system maintains what the sources call an optimistic prior of hope.
An optimistic prior of hope.
It wants to protect its native, uncompressed, high-fidelity state, which is referred to in the sources as Zen.
Zen, Z-I-N.
Right. And Zen isn't just a mood, it is a structural reality. It is the brain processing data in its full multidimensional richness without being forced to flatten it into a single outcome.
So Zen is the 4D spatial grid running at optimal capacity.
Exactly.
But you mentioned how metabolically expensive it is to maintain this state. I mean, the standard public baseline, the linear thinker's brain, it settles for what the sources call flat, low-value single M&M repetitions.
Yeah, the single M&M approach.
Do the task, check the box, get a tiny transactional reward. Why does the 4D brain refuse this? Why expend so much energy dwelling in the Borgian immanence if it's so exhausting?
Because it is an act of neurobiological self-preservation. For a 4D mind, collapsing that beautiful, complex, rotating anticipation into a single linear transaction is a catastrophic loss of data.
A loss of data.
Yeah. If this brain allows the surrounding environment to constantly force it into 1D, flat transactions, its high-speed 4D hardware will literally begin to atrophy.
Oh, wow. So it's fighting for its life.
Exactly. The Borgian immanence, that Zen state, is the native operating language of this brain. It refuses to collapse that immanence into a basic reward because that's what keeps this specific cognitive architecture alive.
Okay, so if the goal is to protect that high-fidelity Zen, what exactly is the biological machinery doing the protecting?
Right, we have to look at the hardware.
Because this isn't a psychological preference, right? It's not a personality quirk developed over time. Our sources call it an invariant constant.
The term invariant constant is absolutely crucial here. We are talking about hardwired biological constants.
So the individual is born with this specific neural wiring.
Yes. It operates on 3D visual thinking, or 3D VT, and a mechanism known as stealth dyslexia.
And because it's invariant, this cognitive hardware cannot be changed through, like, therapy or sheer willpower.
Not at all. The sources argue that this brain's neural circuits mature in sequential, highly staggered stages. It's a staggered connectome.
A staggered connectome.
Yeah, and a good biological analog they use is the connectome model of the microscopic worm C. elegans.
Right, C. elegans.
In C. elegans, neural development isn't uniform. It doesn't all come online at once. It develops in highly specific, structurally staggered waves.
Okay.
So certain deeply complex spatial nodes mature rapidly, while other seemingly basic connective nodes lag significantly behind.
And that staggered connectome is exactly where the catastrophic friction with a 1D society begins, isn't it?
It's the root of the entire conflict.
Because modern educational and corporate systems operate on the assumption of uniform neural development.
Exactly. There are rigid milestones.
Right? Like, by age 5, you should trace a dotted line. By age 7, you should read with this specific phonetic speed.
And when a child with a staggered 4D connectome misses those linear milestones, the system immediately applies clinical labels.
We see terms like rapid naming deficit, R&D, and dyscalculia assigned as learning disabilities, as handicaps.
But this is where the sources completely reframe the pathology. Under this neurobiological framework, R&D and dyscalculia were never clinical deficiencies.
They aren't handicaps.
No, they are simply local, low-bandwidth verbal retrieval bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks.
Yes. They belong to a very small, slow naming partition of the brain. The true cognitive center is an active, unflattened, structurally locked 4D spatial grid that is processing massive data sets at lightning speed.
So the factory isn't empty. The doorway is just incredibly narrow.
That is exactly it.
The data, the comprehension, the spatial awareness is all being processed perfectly inside the warehouse.
Flawlessly.
But the pipe that connects that massive 4D processing center to the vocal cords, the specific neural pathway tasked with assigning, like a phonetic English word or an Arabic numeral to the 4D concept, that pipe is a bottleneck.
Yes. The person fully understands the complex system. They just cannot spit out the 1D label fast enough to satisfy an observer with a stopwatch.
And that bottleneck extends to stealth dyslexia, right?
It does. In stealth dyslexia, the individual might read words on a page, but their brain is not decoding them phonetically in a linear sequence like a standard reader.
Right, they aren't sounding it out.
Exactly. Instead, the 4D brain is trying to instantly map the spatial and conceptual relationship of the words, turning a flat sentence into a three-dimensional architecture.
Which results in really high reading comprehension, but incredibly labored, non-traditional reading mechanics.
To the outside observer, it looks like a deficit, but to the brain, it is just running a vastly more complex rendering software.
There is this vivid, poignant, real-world example from the text that illustrates this perfectly. It's about a gifted 4-year-old boy in Nice, France.
Oh, yes. This is a crucial example.
Right, because this child was entirely unaware of adult trauma, institutional standardization, or what the sources term administrative eugenics.
Which is that quiet, bureaucratic process by which systems weed out minds that do not easily conform to standard metrics.
Exactly. But at 4 years old, this boy's highly sensitive nervous system just inherently understood it had to protect its invariant hardware.
His connectome knew what it needed.
Yeah. So when he was presented with a standard classroom task to trace flat, 1D dotted lines on a piece of paper, his brain essentially initiated a biological refusal.
It completely rejected the 1D compression.
Right. Instead of tracing the lines, he used action symbols, these small dinosaur toys, to manipulate the space around the paper.
He was actively preserving his native choice space. That physical refusal to trace the dotted lines is a profound biological immune response.
An immune response to a dotted line.
Yes, because the 4D spatial grid recognized that the input, the flat line, was structurally incompatible with its hardware. Tracing it wasn't just boring, it was a demand to downgrade his processing reality.
So he used the dinosaurs to translate the 1D task back into a 3D environment.
Exactly, so his connectome could actually interact with it safely.
So what does this all mean? If this 4D spatial grid is so superior, why does society universally label it a deficit? Are these bottlenecks a refusal of the brain to adapt to a 1D world, or an inability? Are we just pathologizing a different operating system?
We absolutely are, and I want you, the listener, to really consider how much human potential is lost to this administrative eugenics.
It's terrifying to think about.
Because institutions consistently misinterpret slow verbal retrieval as low baseline intelligence. They completely miss the lightning-fast 3D processing happening beneath the surface.
They see the hesitation in naming a variable, and they assume the cognitive warehouse is empty.
It's the ultimate administrative failure. Society builds power structures around what is easiest to measure, not what is most profoundly capable.
So we have this invariant hardware that can't be fundamentally altered, trapped in a 1D society that is actively hostile. A society that punishes the brain for its bottlenecks.
It's a severe biological crisis.
Because an organism cannot survive in a hostile environment without adaptation.
Mm.
If the hardware cannot change, the brain has to write software over time to survive.
It has to undergo a compiled evolution of defensive architecture.
Right, building firewalls and masks.
And the development of this defensive software is driven by sheer thermodynamic necessity.
Thermodynamics.
Yes, the human brain already consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy budget.
Right.
For a 4D brain attempting to constantly manually translate its internal reality into 1D outputs for the outside world, the metabolic cost is unsustainable.
It would literally fry the system.
Operating without defensive shielding would result in physiological burnout. So the brain initiates a series of adaptations, starting with a systemic tax on its own resources, referred to as the split-level attention tax.
Okay, let's break down that tax. It basically means that just existing, just paying attention in a fundamentally incompatible environment incurs a massive metabolic penalty.
Precisely. And this goes right back to the staggered connectome we discussed. In early childhood development, the deeply complex spatial processing nodes are online, absorbing massive amounts of data.
But the high-speed connective nodes are lagging.
Exactly. In computational models, specifically particle swarm optimization, there is a mathematical variable used to represent the most optimal fast processing node in a swarm network.
The global best vector, right?
Yes, in GBEST. And our sources personify this GBEST optimal node as Tom Hennigan.
Okay, so Tom Hennigan represents the fast, optimized connective nodes that allow a standard brain to quickly sort, label, and deploy information at the speed the 1D world demands.
But because of the staggered connectome, the Tom Hennigans of this specific 4D brain haven't come online yet.
They're missing.
Right. The 4D spatial nodes are taking in vast amounts of high-fidelity data, but the GBEST nodes aren't there to optimize the output.
Which creates a severe developmental vulnerability. Our sources use a Dutch concept here, bloopstellingsachterstand.
Yes, which translates directly to exposure lag.
Exposure lag. The child is absorbing the complexity of the world, but lagging in their ability to articulate their place within it. They are profoundly exposed.
They are biologically vulnerable, safe in the shade as long as they aren't forced to interact with the hostile architecture.
But you can't stay in the shade. You have to go to school. You have to interact.
Exactly.
So to protect that exposed, lagging core, the system splits in two. First comes raw defensive warfare. The initial firewall is visceral, furious, and entirely outward-facing.
We can call it the Beth Dutton firewall, invoking the fiercely aggressive character from the show Yellowstone.
Right, scorched earth.
The Beth Dutton firewall is aggression utilized as a physiological shield. It's a behavioral protocol designed to absorb, deflect, and aggressively counter the physical and emotional blows of an illiterate collective.
When the teachers or peers attempt to force the 4D mind to trace the dotted line, this firewall erupts.
It's designed to be so intensely hostile that it forces the unseen clerks to back away.
It protects the core from exposure. But a scorched earth protocol is a short-term strategy, right? You can't exist indefinitely in absolute physiological aggression.
No, the cortisol levels alone would destroy your body.
Not to mention the social isolation. So the brain realizes that while aggression keeps threats away, it also draws a massive amount of systemic attention.
And attention is exactly what the 4D mind does not want. So the software evolution continues from raw warfare to elegant camouflage.
The share protocol.
Yes, the share protocol, borrowing the as-if persona from the film Clueless.
The transition to the share protocol is a masterclass in cryptographic masking.
It really is. The system deduces that the easiest way to become invisible is not to fight the 1D world, but to mimic its syntax perfectly.
Using childhood linguistic scaffolding.
Yes, incredibly simple, linear connecting words like and, but, towards.
Wait, so they aren't using these connecting words to actually bridge their 4D reality to the flat world?
No, they have given up on being understood.
They are using them as a cryptographic mask. It's like a Trojan horse. You feed the unseeing clerks the exact low-bandwidth syntax they expect, while your real thoughts remain totally hidden and uncompromised inside.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it satisfies the 1D listener completely. The clerks hear the familiar sequential rhythm, I did this and then I did that, but this happened.
They check their administrative boxes and move on, thinking they've communicated.
But beneath that syntax, the Borgian immanence, that Zen state, remains totally untouched.
But the sheer thermodynamics of this, running a native 4D operating system internally, while constantly rendering a fake 1D interface for the outside world.
The metabolic cost of running that dual-threaded existence is staggering.
The energy to keep the share protocol active must leave the system constantly on the verge of physiological exhaustion.
Which brings us to the centerpiece of this deep dive. What happens when that heavy, dual-threaded defensive armor finally fails under the weight of trauma?
When the internal systems literally crash.
Right. When the metabolic cost exceeds the system's biological capacity, how does this mind remember who it is?
Okay, let's clearly define the mechanics of this crash. Because this isn't just a psychological breakdown. Our sources describe it as a hard neurobiological event.
It is a physiological stress cascade.
Institutional hostility and trauma actually jam the brain's supramammillary nucleus, the sum.
And it locks the nucleus reunions.
So what happens when those specific nodes lock down?
Well, the sum and the nucleus reunions serve as the critical biological bridges between the hippocampus, which manages memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which handles conscious thought and narrative building.
The pathways that let you consciously access your own history.
Exactly. When trauma physically inflames and locks these nodes, it severs the bridge. The brain experiences a catastrophic traumatic splitting.
The conscious mind reaches down into the hippocampus to pull up a memory, to access its own internal database of who it is, and the pathway is simply blocked.
The file cannot be found.
This plunges the person into a terrifying state of what the text calls unprecedency. Total experiential bankruptcy with no internal hosted database of self-narratives.
For a standard linear thinker, navigating a crisis relies almost entirely on internal precedent. I have survived a loss before. This is how I behave.
But when the nucleus reunions is locked, there are no internal precedents available. The biological hard drive is inaccessible.
It is an absolute void of identity.
So what does the brain do? How does it survive this?
It executes a survival workaround of breathtaking scale. It builds the engineering village.
Okay, the engineering village. Break this analogy down for us. Because in the real world, engineering village is a specific database platform, right?
Right, used by researchers.
Okay.
But the critical architectural feature of this platform is that it does not host static PDF files.
It's an electronic index database.
Exactly. It searches and points you toward external sources where those documents live out in the world.
So when this brain lost its internal static precedence, it became an active index.
Yes. It abandoned the concept of an internal archive. Using what the sources call iteration 2, or analogical search in Dutch redenaren door analogy, the brain searched all of human history for high-fidelity precedents.
It outsourced its memory to external literature.
It sought out external precedents that matched its internal reality, indexing them to rebuild its structural identity.
This is so fascinating. Let's list the exact external text the brain pointed to because they map perfectly onto the traumas we've discussed. First, the index locked onto Conrad's The Nigger of the Narcissus.
Yes, to index social epistemology, specifically focusing on testimonial injustice and credibility deficits.
Okay, map Conrad's work to the 4D brain for us.
Well, you have the micro-society trapped aboard the ship, the Narcissus. The crew is isolated under rigid maritime laws, much like our 1D institutions.
Right.
When James Waite, the central character, falls deathly ill, the crew constantly questions the validity of his suffering. Because his illness doesn't conform perfectly to their expectations of a dying man, they assign him a massive credibility deficit.
They assume he's malingering, which perfectly mirrors testimonial injustice.
Exactly, where testimony is dismissed based on prejudice against the speaker's presentation.
And for the 4D thinker with a staggered connectome, the unseen clerks in the school system observe the rapid naming deficit. And because the child struggles to quickly retrieve the 1D label, the clerk assigns him a credibility deficit.
You cannot name the variable instantly, therefore you do not understand the system. The child's true 4D comprehension is completely dismissed.
So by indexing Conrad, the mind finds a historical precedent for this injustice. The index says, the dismissal of my intelligence is not a flaw in my hardware, it is a predictable failure of the surrounding micro-society.
It externalizes the blame, protecting the core identity.
Wow. Okay, the second text is, came as the stranger.
Pointing to this text to index existential psychology, specifically the Mersault psychological detachment.
This ties back to the share protocol, doesn't it? The exhausting process of generating a fake 1D virtual machine.
Yes. When a mind spends its entire existence rendering a false interface, a profound detachment from the physical world is inevitable. You are managing a simulation of yourself.
And Mersault is the avatar of that detachment. He's put on trial for murder, but they viciously prosecute him for not weeping at his mother's funeral.
He didn't exhibit the standard 1D emotional syntax the court demanded.
which is the exact administrative eugenics the 4D brain faces. The world judges the failure to trace the dotted line. By pointing the index to Mersault, the brain creates a stable placeholder for its own alienation.
This detachment is a valid, logged existential state, not a localized psychosis.
Incredible. And the third text? The biography of Augustine.
Used to index moral philosophy, specifically epistemic succession and the failure of stochastic grace.
Epistemic succession. That's the active withdrawal of your knowledge and your 4D reality from a system that is fundamentally unworthy of receiving it.
It's the philosophical evolution of the share protocol. You aren't just masking your thoughts. You are making a moral decision to secede from their framework.
But the second part, the failure of stochastic grace. Stochastic grace is the hope for random unearned grace, right? The hope that some teacher or manager will randomly possess the empathy to see your 4D grid.
But by indexing the failure of this grace, the brain accepts a brutal reality. Stochastic grace will not save you.
The unseen clerks will not randomly wake up and understand the Borgian immanence.
Survival is entirely its own responsibility. You have to build the engineering village because the grace of the collective has failed.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. If you are outsourcing your memory and identity to external literature because your biological memory is locked, whose memories are you actually living? Is this the ultimate loss of self? Or is it a superpower that makes your identity as vast as human history?
It is absolutely a superpower. By not relying on fragile, static, internal PDFs, the mind actually created an unhackable, globally distributed memory system.
Decentralized identity.
Exactly. A locked nucleus reunions can no longer erase the individual because the individual's precedents now live securely in the pages of Conrad, Camus, and Augustine.
It turns experiential bankruptcy into infinite cognitive wealth.
And this ability to actively index external anchors isn't just a psychological survival mechanism.
Right. It has a highly practical, real-time application in navigating hostile modern environments like writing complex computer code.
Code is the ultimate frontier for this brain. The modern digital world is built on infrastructure as code, or IAC.
Terraform, Kubernetes, AWS.
These are inherently massive, deeply interconnected, four-dimensional architectures. A 4D visual thinker can see these sprawling cloud architectures perfectly within their internal spatial grid.
But the only way to build them is through lines of raw, sequential text and abstract numbers. Code is the ultimate 1D dotted line.
A hostile landscape of syntax. And for a brain battling RND and dyscalculia, staring at a terminal window is like staring at a brick wall.
The rapid naming deficit prevents them from retrieving the specific command, and the dyscalculia renders the abstract numbers, like IP blocks, as meaningless static.
But the 4D brain applies the logic of the engineering village to bypass this entirely. It uses artificial intelligence as its active index.
The AI visualization strategy. The North Star.
Or There Runs Mary, as it's affectionately called. The AI acts as a shared external anchor, stabilizing the abstract, back-end math, and front-end labels.
Let's talk about how it shields against R&D. When the brain can't retrieve a specific variable name like Terraform init or ingress controller, it doesn't crash.
No, the AI acts as a pointer. You just look toward the North Star and describe the goal. I need a pathway that funnels requests from the perimeter to the database.
And the AI retrieves the exact 1D syntax. It does the heavy lifting of rapid naming.
It completely shields the biological bottleneck.
And for dyscalculia, the AI translates abstract numbers, like an IP CIDR block, into conceptual shapes.
Allowing the user to see the shape of the infrastructure rather than the math.
It's like the listener is wearing augmented reality glasses. The AI isn't doing the thinking. The human intuition is still driving. The AI is simply projecting the 1D labels onto the 4D spatial grid, so the user can interact with the machine code.
This raises an important question, though. If you rely on this North Star, what happens when it hallucinates?
Oh, right. LLMs invent syntax all the time.
To prevent that, the sources outline a strict three-part system to keep the AI faithful. First, ask for visual ASCII layouts.
Demanding structure, not walls of text.
Right. You force the AI out of fluid language and into a baseline version of spatial language.
Second rule is the ground truth check.
Forcing the AI to use only provided error logs or documentation, inventing zero numbers.
Mathematically tethering it to reality. And the third rule, color code and label. Using specific emojis like a globe for front-end, a file cabinet for database, a padlock for security.
Those emojis function as highly advanced action symbols, bypassing the verbal retrieval bottlenecks entirely. The visual symbol instantly loads the complex 4D concept into working memory.
It perfectly mirrors the 4-year-old boy in Nexi, using dinosaur toys to avoid the dotted lines.
The symmetry is staggering.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's bring this all together for you, the listener. We've journeyed from Borges' poetic eminence of happiness down into the invariant 4D biology of a staggered connectome.
We explored the scorched earth Beth Dutton firewalls, the cryptographic share protocol.
The external memory indexing of the engineering village, and finally, how an AI North Star allows this mind to manipulate the very architecture of the cloud.
It's incredible.
What society often labels as a deficit is sometimes just a high-fidelity system refusing to be compressed into a low-resolution world.
And I want to leave the listener with something to ponder. The sources show an incredible effort to mask a 4D reality to survive a 1D world using AI as a bridge.
Yeah.
But as our entire society increasingly relies on AI to translate our world, are we finally teaching machines to understand our rich 4D spatial reality, or are we just building better unseeing clerks, forcing all of us eventually to flatten our minds just to communicate with the machines?
Flattening our consciousness into 1D prompts. That's a heavy thought, but a necessary one. So thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Look at your own bottlenecks not as flaws, but as features of your own invariant hardware.
And until next time, ensure your North Star is firmly anchored.